I think usually when I start talking at conferences about the EU, people's eyes glaze over. No, not the EU, please. I've heard enough about the EU. But I want to talk today about how EU law and policy acknowledge and accommodate and regulate children's lives, and to really interrogate whether the EU really advances children's rights in the way that I've been trying to argue that it does for the last number of years. And I think it's fair to say as a starting point that the EU seems a highly unlikely context in which to discuss children's rights. The EU was never set up with children's rights in mind. It was historically set up to forge political and economic kind of alliances between the member states. But I think changes to the EU's constitutional and legal and institutional architecture over the years have generated lots of new opportunities, and I think an absolute necessity for the EU to engage with children's rights through a range of kind of broader and fundamental rights contexts. So today the paper is divided into 4 sections. First, I'm going to look at why the EU is examining children's rights, why children's rights should be regulated at EU level. Secondly, I'm going to look at the nature and scope of that regulation. And thirdly, I'm going to consider how the EU regulates children's rights. In other words, I'm going to look at those ideological building blocks for the EU's children's rights agenda and really critically assess it to consider whether it's kind of truly sensitive to international children's rights standards. And finally, I'm just going to reflect on some mechanisms that need to be put in place to make the EU more accommodating of children's rights and more effective. Okay, so why should the EU regulate children's rights? Well, I think in broad statistical terms, children represent about 1/5 of the EU population. So there's about 107 million children in the EU, and that's under 18. And there are about 5.4 million children born every year across the EU. So statistically, they're important. Now, there are a number of common objections to the EU's intervention in children's rights. Yesterday, when I was getting the taxi from the airport to the conference, I had a really challenging conversation with the taxi driver. I've never had such a... And he was absolutely adamant that the EU was not inappropriate, because he was asking me why I was here, and I was explaining, and he... Honestly, I think he had a couple of PhDs at least, this guy. And I was thinking maybe you'd planted him just to get me prepped. But he was just saying, no, the EU is not really an appropriate forum. We've got all of these other international forums. So he kind of summed up the main objections to EU intervention in children's rights for me. First of all, I think that the EU lacks relevance to children. The EU is predominantly focused on forging internal market issues, internal sort of collaboration between the member states on the free movement of goods, services, capital, people, and all of that sort of stuff. It's about maximising adults' capacity to contribute to the economy, chiefly through their participation in employment and as recipients of services. So it's argued that all of that stuff impacts only in a direct, sort of tangential way to children. And that children's rights will be automatically accommodated once you accommodate the interests of the parents or the adults by proxy. I think secondly is that sufficient international children's rights measures are already in place. We've got all of this kinds of Europe stuff that Ursula's looked at, and we've got the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that has been ratified by all of the 27 member states. Why do we need the EU duplicating that work and perhaps even undermining it with less beneficial standards? But I think despite those kind of common objections, there are a lot more persuasive arguments that can be put forward in favour. And I would sum these up under 4 titles: damage limitation, added value, strategic investment, and children as contributors. So in terms of the damage limitation, I think the importance of averting any potential breaches of children's rights that arise out of the operation of EU law is really key. Even the blandest and seemingly kind of innocuous EU measures can have a significant impact on children's rights and children's lives. So internal market measures aimed at removing barriers to the free movement of goods or services, have to be balanced against the need to subject such goods and services to sufficient scrutiny to ensure that by moving those between member states, you're not subjecting children to harm, you're not exposing children to harm. Similarly, the gradual erosion of internal borders between the member states undoubtedly facilitates the more nefarious pursuits of international child abduction, corrupt adoption practices, child trafficking, human smuggling, all of that sort of stuff. And those are facilitated through the erosion of these administrative and checks at the borders. But I think even in more indirect terms, the EU equality law framework, which enables mothers to re-enter the labour market following childbirth, and enabling working parents to really organise their domestic responsibilities around their employed activities, have important knock-on effects for children in terms of the amount and the quality of childcare that is provided for those children, in the way that childcare is administered. And even that kind of whole multiplicity of EU environmental measures, agricultural or transport initiatives, will also carry consequences for the consumers and residents of the communities in which those measures are being implemented, whether they're adults or children. So all of those examples illustrate that virtually every aspect of EU law has consequences for children. And it's important that the EU institutions put in place mechanisms to ensure that those measures don't pose a threat to children, that they're enhancing of children's rights. Okay, so added value then. Well, I think this acknowledges the potential of the EU to actually make an important contribution over and above what can be achieved at the international level or at the national level. Now, that's particularly the case in terms of national measures for children's rights that cross jurisdictional boundaries, such as immigration, free movement of goods, services, people, trafficking, parental child abduction. Those measures cannot be addressed by member states acting alone. There has to be a level of coherence between them. Now, the international community is good. We've got the Hague Convention, but as Ashleen already said, that the international measures are not universally adopted by all of the countries implicated in these issues. They're very difficult to enforce. EU law, on the other hand, produces supranational, uniformly enforceable laws that have to be implemented by the member states. Now, that's not always the best way in terms of children's rights, but it's certainly a very powerful legal and political tool. Those measures then have to be implemented in a uniform, consistent way. Added to that, I think, is the fact that the EU has significant political and economic resources at its disposal. It's pretty wealthy, the EU, despite what's happening in Greece at the moment. And I think that those resources can be usefully harnessed by domestic authorities and international stakeholders to forge a very constructive dialogue between all of these countries that share common problems. So it's not about just the EU imposing its supranational laws on the member states, regardless of their contextual issues. It's about offering this forum, this platform, and funding to accompany it to bring together all of these actors to agree sort of mutually set benchmarks and to stimulate wide dissemination and policy exchange. Okay, children as a strategic investment then. Well, I think one of the key things for the EU relates to investment in children as a more kind of strategic investment for the future. It's about nurturing the productive workers, carers and childbearers of the future. And that's essential for offsetting the economic and social incohesion associated with a perceptible European-wide demographic decline, this economic crisis that seems to be ongoing, and an ageing population. So investment in children is key to try and offset those issues. But on a more abstract level, the EU has a vested interest in inculcating in our youth a very clear sense of European identity and membership, including a sense of political consciousness and social responsibility, with a view to securing their allegiance to the European project, I suppose, as they enter into adulthood, thereby sort of consolidating the credibility of the EU for the future. And finally then, I think it's about valuing children's contributions to the EU in the here and now. A lot of what I've talked about is about investment priorities, children's future or potential value as contributors to the EU. But I think EU law and policy can also serve to acknowledge and support children's contributions. And I think there are a number of important practical illustrations of that. For instance, we now have a substantial body of research revealing the extent to which children's direct contribution to European domestic economies through their engagement in formal, paid employment, as consumers, and as clients of a vast range of services like education and leisure and sport, and in a less quantifiable yet equally valid domestic caring and houseworking arrangements, in community-based voluntary programmes, and just through sort of social interaction, through acting as important advocates for their parents if they're in immigrant communities, and they're acting as kind of informal translators to facilitate their family's integration. So children are playing a really important part in facilitating the EU economy as well. So that's the why I think the EU should be regulating children's rights. But what does it do in relation to children's rights? I think, notwithstanding all of those what might seem like highly persuasive arguments for EU investment in children's rights, the way that EU children's rights has evolved over the years has been incredibly haphazard. It's been incredibly half-hearted, and it's been so much of a sideline to, or even a distraction from the EU's core focus on building the economy and forging these political alliances. But I think there are three key dynamics that have shaped children's rights to almost such that it's emerged into a sort of discrete EU discipline in its own right. First, we have the sort of market integration dynamic. This is how children's rights emerged initially. We had free movement between the countries of the EU through the free movement of persons, and children's rights had to be accommodated within that. You couldn't say workers can move between the member states without also accommodating the fact that they would be bringing their families with them. And if you're going to bring your family with you to another member state, you have to make sure that your kids can access education. You have to make sure that your kids and your family can access healthcare. So it was about starting as a free movement issue for workers, but then that gradually had to be extended to their family members as well to make it feasible for the workers to move. I think secondly then is this kind of social integration dynamic. The social integration programme at EU level, a bit like the internal market agenda, initially targeted the needs of the EU adult population, and that acknowledged that there was a negative correlation between unemployment and poverty. In other words, if you can address poverty issues and social integration issues, then you can ensure that more people get into employment and therefore build up the EU economy. Now, as a result of that, those social inclusion measures started to interrogate the effects of social exclusion on children, ultimately with a view to developing a range of early intervention strategies, anti-child poverty strategies through education. They recognised that poverty is inherited. Social exclusion is inherited from your parents. So if you can attack that at those very, very early stages, then you have a chance of addressing it. Okay, those first two dynamics illustrate that children's rights were still very much incidental to these kind of core priorities, primarily economic priorities. But I think what they did do was create this legal and policy domino effect. You had these measures, but then they gradually sort of permeated to broader areas to do with children and stimulated a diverse range of child-related issues. But there was still no evidence of any coherent, strategic approach to children's rights. No clear statement of the aims and objectives of what EU child law policy were. nor was there much evidence that the EU children's rights were being constructed in any sort of firm ideological framework. There was no sense that it was grounded in children's rights as we know it from a CRC perspective or whatever. But I think at the turn of the millennium, there was a number of constitutional changes that really marked the turning point for children's rights, primarily because fundamental rights, human rights, were integrated much more explicitly into the EU constitutional framework. Now, that process, and I won't go into the details of that, but those developments have undoubtedly enhanced the legitimacy of the EU Children's Rights Campaign. Fundamental rights is now being used as the common kind of constitutional hook on which to hang children's rights initiatives. So even in the more sterile contexts in which children's rights feature, like consumer law or something, fundamental rights is really creeping in to those frameworks. Now, such is the pervasiveness of fundamental rights at EU level that it now underpins the operation of internal market, social integration, all of those kinds of initiatives. So we've got this much greater coherence now. And that culminated in the publication in 2011 of the EU Agenda on the Rights of the Child. There have been rumblings about an EU agenda for children's rights for some years, but this was what it was, and it was a bit disappointing, but it's a good starting point. What it does is it sets out what the EU is going to do across a range of children's rights issues for the coming years, primarily in relation to Roma children, missing children, vulnerable victims, online safety. But it also underpins that agenda with a couple of general principles, notably fundamental rights, the need to develop an evidence-based approach to children's rights, and also cooperating with international and external stakeholders. So that's the kind of the tenor of the agenda. So what do we mean by rights when we talk about the EU Children's Rights Agenda? The whole title of the EU Children's Rights Agenda suggests that it's firmly ensconced in a rights-based framework, but what does the EU really mean when it talks about a rights-based framework? I think that the rhetorical and legal and political value of rights seems like an obvious discourse within which to sort of develop child-related provision. But does the EU really know what it's talking about? What does it really mean in practice? And I think I'm kind of glad Laura's not here, because I'm sure her paper would have just wiped the floor with me on this. But a rights-based approach, I think, is notoriously difficult to define. We talk about children's rights and we accept what it is in a rights-based approach, but how do we really define it? And it's been variously associated with notions of accountability, universality, international cooperation, participation, best interests, all of those kind of normative issues. And with that in mind, a rights-based framework is as much about a process as it is about a product. It implies a duty to adapt or institute processes that facilitate the fulfilment of those rights as much as the actual rights themselves. Now, the EU Agenda on the Rights of the Child identifies the UNCRC as one of the main building blocks for its rights framework, and it specifically pinpoints the best interests of the child as the overarching guiding principle. I'll just put a couple of little extracts from the agenda up there. Now, explicit reference to the CRC is highly symbolic for the EU. It's affirming the EU's willingness to kind of draw on this instrument in a much more direct, far-reaching way to supplement what up until now have really been very vague references to rights within the treaty. Now, while I was preparing this paper, a friend of mine, she sent me this card, and it's like, "Buy me, Freya," said the frock, "and I will make you into a beautiful and whole and complete human being. Do not be silly," said her man, "for a frock alone cannot do that." "True," said Freya, "I will have the shoes and the bag as well." And it struck me that the EU's relationship, I love the way that the man is the real sort of sound of reason here. Is the kind of rational person in this. It struck me that the EU's relationship with the UNCRC is a bit like Freya's relationship with the beautiful frock. The CRC is always seen as this essential accessory for any children's rights agenda at any level. It's the most extensively endorsed kind of global instrument, and it has this comprehensive catalogue of rights. But like Freya's man, we have to question whether mere allusion to the CRC as that kind of critical accessory adds much substance to the agenda. Is it really going to enhance the life of children's rights at EU level in the way that it's conveyed? Or whether it just looks impressive in what is really the shop window of children's rights that the EU agenda has come to represent. So what impact has the CRC really had on children's rights in the EU? What evidence do we have? Sorry, 2 minutes, oh gee. Okay, right, well, the CRC is now routinely embedded in legislative instruments. We have reference to the CRC. It very rarely imposes any binding obligations though. It says it must be in accordance with Article 3 of the CRC, or the best interests of the child, but there's no obligations as far as implementing that at the domestic level. The CRC is now routinely referred to in sort of policy instruments like the social inclusion agenda and all of those kinds of things. But again, it's just a reference. There has been some limited judicial allusion. I think there's a handful of cases where the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, has talked about the CRC, but in very sort of uncomfortable terms. In fact, there's only been one case to date in which, and it was a free movement of goods case, in which the CRC actually was given decisive weight. Children's rights considerations were actually given decisive weight. So there's lots of reference to it, but no sort of particular weight given to it. And I suppose more artistically, this is the way that I would see children's rights. It's highly persuasive, legally and politically, as a rhetoric. It gives the agenda and the EU Children's Rights Action this immediate force and ideological legitimacy in relation to children that has been lacking up to now. And a rights discourse pushes children to the forefront of the EU's consciousness. It offers a discursive language that international stakeholders are familiar with and that national stakeholders also feel very receptive to. And it also implies a degree of moral accountability, even if the legal sanctions are relatively weak. But I think more cynically, I'd say that there's, in a broader view of how the EU children's rights have evolved, I think we've kind of progressed from a subversion of children's rights that just weren't considered within EU law, to inserting them just on a kind of textual level but with no real substance, to what is now potentially a perversion of children's rights. And it comes back to some of the points that Carl was making earlier, that the EU children's rights agenda is absolutely dominated by child protection issues. It's become an absolute obsession of the EU. Their child participation agenda is starting to emerge, but as far as the EU is concerned, and if you look at the agenda, child participation is really about building a website for children and giving them information on what EU law and policy is. So it's almost like a perversion of children's rights as far as the EU is concerned. So or at least a partial picture, maybe perversion's a bit strong. So what hope then have we got of the EU pursuing a more empowering approach to children's rights? And I think, for me, having spent a bit of time looking at the EU's approach, I think the problem with the EU is that it's calibrating its children's rights agenda to the demands of the international community in a very sort of insecure way. The EU lacks confidence as far as children's rights is concerned. But really, what it needs to do is capitalise on the resources that are already at its disposal, legally and politically, and carve out a real sort of distinctive niche in children's rights so that it can take it forward in a much more persuasive way. And I think there are a few legal tools to enable it to do this, and I'll just talk about these in a few seconds. The EU has some very clear, explicit constitutional and legal tools that have provided the framework for a number of years for a vast amount of law and policy that have actually a real impact on children's rights. And I suppose it's about trying to get away from this obsession with the CRC, which obviously has to inform all of these different areas and contexts. But it's not the only mechanism that we have. So EU citizenship, while it's confined mostly to children of EU nationality of the member states, it has produced tangible rights in all of the member states for migrant children. You can access education and healthcare and all sorts of benefits. You can even, if you can establish that your child is a citizen, you can even anchor the whole family's rights to remain in a member state if they don't qualify otherwise. So citizenship, albeit in that limited context, is very important. Equally, the non-discrimination principle has a grounding in the EU treaties. That has formed the framework for a number of equality instruments, like the Race Directive. The Race Directive in particular can be used by children to ensure equality of access and provision within education in a way that a lot of the Council of Europe, the ECHR provisions on education, can't necessarily. I think also the equality framework, the non-discrimination framework, can help children in more indirect ways through the reconciliation of work and family life strategy, childcare for children, even discrimination by association has been very successful in that context. And finally, social inclusion. The EU has got a massive social inclusion agenda now that will stretch to 2020 with a number of goals, benchmarks that have been mutually agreed by the member states and which has a huge anti-poverty framework within that. And by anti-poverty, I'm not just talking about material deprivation, I'm talking about children's rights in terms of their well-being, securing life chances, access to legal, social welfare and cultural opportunities and all of that. So just as a very final note of conclusion then, I think the EU's agenda for children's rights represents really exciting prospects for the future of children's rights, not only at EU level but internationally too. But I think we need to sort of have a degree of kind of caution and realism. Sorry, that's my children's rights normative quad. And this is maybe questions to ask you. Is EU intervention in children's rights unequivocally appropriate and valuable? There are certain things that the EU should not be doing because it can add no value. It's already being done by the Council of Europe or by the UN. Should its actions be legitimately confined to areas in which there's no satisfactory solution elsewhere? And how can we ensure that the EU is not undermining the efforts of other stakeholders in what it's doing? And I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that. But we should ensure that what the EU is doing is creating positive, meaningful and sustainable results. And that can only be achieved if there's effective monitoring of what the EU is doing on the ground, through indicators, the impact assessments and that sort of stuff, and that's highly underdeveloped at EU level. We've developed the tools, but the EU has yet to implement them. But if those are achieved, we may well be facing the ironic prospect of the EU, which for so long has been completely antipathetic to children's rights, actually being at the vanguard of children's rights, being one of their greatest proponents. And I think in terms of your law clinic as well, there are so many possibilities in terms of the everyday queries that you're getting to engage with what the EU legal and policy framework can do. Thank you.